Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, NetScaler Management and Analytics System, Lessons from the Field. My name is Sarah Queen, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for our services portfolio here at Citrix. In today's session, we'll drill down into NetScaler MAS capabilities and use cases with recommendations and caveats from the field that will help you get the greatest return from this technology. You certainly don't want to miss the tips and tricks at the conclusion of the presentation. We will then close with our professional services offerings that are available to support your journey should you need it. Before we go into the presentation, let me quickly review a few housekeeping details. We will have a live Q&A session toward the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording this event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, now I will hand it over to Adi Trivedi, Services Relationship Manager on our Americas Professional Services team. Adi?
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. MAS was introduced in early to mid-2016, and we've seen a tremendous amount of interest from our customers since then. Jay and I represent our Citrix Professional Services team, and we are here to talk about a broad set of topics surrounding MAS based on our team's experience in deploying MAS across a variety of customers. My role as a Services Relationship Manager is to understand customer challenges associated with adopting Citrix networking products so we can help identify the right work effort required for our consulting services team to provide their expert guidance on Citrix NetScaler ADC, MAS, and SD-WAN related projects. I'll pass it over to you, to Jay, for his introduction.
Sure. Hey, Adi, how are you? Thanks for the introduction. So I'm an enterprise architect here at Citrix Consulting, and my role is to drive technical success for our projects, including providing best practices for our various networking products here at Citrix.
Thanks, Jay. So before we go any further, let me start with clearing one thing out. I've heard a couple acronyms around NMAS, MAS. So which one is it, Jay? Is it MAS or NMAS?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, people tend to pronounce it different ways, and it's MAS, MAS, etc. Initially we started out calling it NMAS, and really the acronym stands for NetScaler Management and Analytics Systems, but you may see it commonly referred to just as Citrix MAS or NMAS, and they're used interchangeably.
Gotcha. So now that we have that cleared, before we dig deep into MAS, it's important to understand the evolution of MAS, including some solutions that our customers may have heard of, namely Command Center and Insight Center. So Jay, could you talk about those platforms? Give us your opinion on those from the perspective of three different types of Citrix customers. One, the customers who are looking to deploy Insight Center and Command Center today. What would you say to the customers who have currently deployed Insight Center and Command Center and are looking at MAS? And three, the customers who own NetScalers and SD-WAN and aren't looking at Insight Center, Command Center, or MAS as of yet.
Sure. Okay. So I'll start off talking a little bit about kind of Command Center first, and then we'll move to Insight Center and MAS, right? So Command Center was Citrix's first systems management offering, and we've had that for a very long time. It was essentially a software that you'd install on Windows, Linux. It had support for third-party databases, etc. And it was a great tool. It gave you access to automated backups, recovery, cert management, role-based access control, reporting. It allowed admins to set up access for the different admin groups who could come in and enable, disable services, vService, etc. Right? And then after Command Center, we came up with another product called Insight Center. And that particular offering was designed specifically initially for the Citrix Zen app portfolio, and we called it HCX Insight. And then we added some more analytical platforms like Web Insight, Security Insight, Gateway Insight, etc. And all these things provide granular reporting and troubleshooting mechanisms for the various platforms like the Citrix Zen app, for your web applications, for App Firewall, etc. Right? Now we come to MAS, and MAS essentially was your single pane of glass that essentially replaced the existing products that we talked about, like the Command Center, the Insight Center, etc. and it allowed you to manage the VPXs, MPX, SDX, CloudBridge, and the SD-WAN products that you referred to in your previous question. But it's not just a replacement. It also allows you to do a lot more. And we'll talk about some of the features, the licensing, et cetera, in the subsequent slides. We'll also talk about why MAS provides a significant value add, at least in my opinion, for managing any NetScaler architecture. In addition to that, MAS is pretty neat because it allows you to actually set up orchestration, and you can set up like API integration with style books, et cetera. MAS is a bit different than Command Center. MAS today is offered similar to Insight Center as like a VM, a virtual machine that you can install on a hypervisor platform, whether it be VMware or Zen Server, Hyper-V, et cetera. It's also offered as a cloud service offering, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Okay, understood. That makes sense. Now, a few questions come up every time we talk to customers about MAS. And they ask us, how do we start using MAS? How much do we need to pay for MAS? So do you mind clarifying how can customers start licensing MAS and start using it? So could you speak to licensing?
Sure, and that's a very common question, Adi. That comes up quite a bit. So NetScaler MAS is something that you can download right off from Citrix website. You can log into www.mycitrix.com, hit on downloads, and you'll be able to download the virtual machine. The only prerequisite for MAS is that you need to have some sort of hypervisor platform. Like I said before, you need to have VMware or Zen Server, Hyper-V, et cetera. But if you have any of those platforms, you can install MAS. It doesn't work like the way we used to have it with Command Center, where you would have where you just have a software that you'd install on like a Windows VM or Linux VM. It's basically a virtual machine, so you do need to have a hypervisor platform. But once you install it, you essentially get a lot of features, that you can kind of play with. There is a subset of features that are free, and there are a subset of features that you would need to pay for. But it is fairly straightforward. So if you need, say, for example, analytics and stuff like that, it's free for up to 30 VIPs. So if you only have 30 virtual servers amongst your infrastructure, across all your different NetScalers, et cetera, then you can pretty much use all the features and not have to worry about it. But if you need to manage more than 30 VIPs, then you would have to reach out to your sales team and purchase those VIPs. I believe in like 100 virtual server blocks. You can speak with your sales representative to discuss how that works in terms of the cost, support, et cetera. But up to 30 is certainly free. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of is that when you install MAS, by default, it'll auto-select your virtual servers for you. And this has been the case in previous versions of MAS in 11.1. But when 12x, we actually gave you a little toggle that you see on the right side that says auto-select virtual servers, right? It's on by default. So what happens is if you start adding like different NetScalers and stuff like that, it'll automatically and randomly select virtual servers for you because it wants you up and running. But if you want flexibility in specific vServers that you want to manage, the first thing I would do is once I set up MAS and set up the initial IP addressing, I would make sure I turn that feature off so I have more flexibility in selecting the right vServers, and then add in my NetScalers and select the VIPs that I want to set up for management. With respect to the features, I have a slide here, and this is taken right off our Citrix Docs webpage, and you can check that out on Citrix Docs as well. But it essentially tells you exactly what features are available for free and which ones require you to have a subscription once you get past the 30 virtual servers. And a lot of these things that do require you to purchase in terms of the licensing is going to be those analytics. So if you're interested in things like Web Insight or HDX Insight, Security Insight, et cetera, those things do require a license that would need to be purchased. But if you're under 30, like I said, you could pretty much use the entire product for free, leverage it, play around with it, and validate all the different functionality that it has to offer. And this is just a quick glimpse at the features that we do offer at MAS, and we're continually adding more features and additional functionality. So definitely keep an eye out on the new builds, and you'll see more options.
Gotcha. Thanks, Jay. Obviously, this slide is pretty highly populated, and the fonts are relatively smaller. But based on what you said, we do have this information in our documentation as well online, correct?
Yep, absolutely. And we'll put in a link for the document on the slide notes, so folks can get a copy of this presentation, click on the link, and get those details as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Jay. Now, I've also known that MAS today needs to be close to the NetScalers and are typically deployed on-prem. I've also heard about MAS as a service, where MAS is hosted on Citrix Cloud and allows users to connect to the MAS service using some plugin called Citrix Connectors. Do you mind speaking to the MAS as a service?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. The most common deployment that we see today is MAS on-prem, right? So where you essentially have your MAS servers that need to be close to the NetScaler. There is a latency requirement, and we'll talk about that in our subsequent slides as well. But MAS as a service is an offering that essentially allows our customers not to actually have any sort of installation of MAS on-prem. They'll essentially install a agent that'll connect to the MAS that is in the cloud and be able to relay all that information so you can see all the data, all your analytics, all your administration, et cetera, right from the cloud offering without actually setting anything up. So that frees you from having any sort of hypervisor infrastructure. It allows you to scale your NetScaler management. So for example, if I have NetScalers in different data centers and different geos, et cetera, I don't need to worry about putting up a separate MAS server on-prem near each one of them and having a place to log into each one and figure that out. I can essentially just say, you know what, I'm just going to have an agent. The agent's going to connect to the cloud, and it's going to give me that single pane of glass that is going to allow me to see everything. So if you have a requirement where you have different NetScalers and different geos, I think it makes sense to definitely look into the MAS as a service. However, if you just want to play around with it really quickly, I think setting up something on-prem is a fairly easy way to validate that functionality. I will mention that today we do not have complete feature parity between the MAS as a service and on-prem, and we can add some details on some of those features and some of those non-parity features, but we'll include that in the slides notes. But if you guys want to check out the MAS as a service, you can certainly subscribe to the Citrix Cloud. There's a 30-day trial. You get access to everything, all the features, the license pack for up to 10 VIPs, and 5 gigs of data. So that should give you a chance, and all our customers a chance to see it, to actually test it out and see how that works.
Understood. All right. Thanks, Jay. While we are on the topic of licensing, a topic that we've been discussing with customers a lot lately is NetScaler pool licensing. Now, obviously, that is not licensing for MAS, but would you mind providing some details on what is pool licensing and how does MAS come into that entire conversation?
Sure. So today, most NetScalers that you're going to see at our customer deployments, they have what I call a perpetual license, right? So you take a license, you install it on the device itself, and you reboot it. The box reads a license from a built-in license server on the NetScaler itself, and you have full access to all the features and the bandwidth. So for example, if you have a MPX 1420, for example, right, that gives you 20 gig throughput or bandwidth on that specific appliance. Now, what we've seen is that most customers don't use the entire 20 gig as is on the appliance. So they may only use, say, 1 gig or 2 gig. So the rest actually goes unused. So where the pool licensing comes in is you actually purchase appliances and or VPXs that work with pooled licensing. So what that means is they don't come with a perpetual license. They use the MAS server, which essentially allows you to check in and check out licenses. But with that, you take these licenses, you install them on the MAS server, and your NetScalers, whether it be VPXs or these specially designed MPXs or SDXs, come in to the MAS server, they check in and essentially get the bandwidth they require. So instead of getting, say, 20 gig throughput for that one appliance, I could split that across multiple appliances, multiple VPXs, and essentially just use what I need. So it's very exciting. We're seeing a few customers who are using it already. So you should definitely check in with your account team if there's interest in using that pool license model and inquire about further details there.
Sounds like MAS is going to be more of an essential part of a customer's environment if they're looking at pool licensing. So thanks for clarifying that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you're using pool licenses, I think it would be a no-brainer to use all the other features of MAS as well. I would use MAS just for the backup recovery purposes as well as certificate management. There are a lot of cool things that we'll talk about that that MAS is used for. But, pooled licensing is an amazing feature, and I expect that we'll see a lot more customers using it as well.
Understood. All right. So now I guess we should make a transition to learning from the field and kind of the things that you have picked up from your experience deploying MAS. Let me start with asking about some architectural differences between MAS and its predecessors that you would typically discuss with a customer.
Sure. So we talked about Command Center and Insight Center briefly before, right? So with Command Center, it was essentially a piece of software that you'd install like on any Windows or Linux machine. You had support for third-party databases. With Insight Center, it was a virtual machine that basically had a built-in database. And MAS, like I said, is also an evolution of Insight Center. So it's also a virtual machine. It's not a software that you can install like on Windows and a Linux host directly. And it comes with a built-in database. So you cannot, have it connect with third-party databases. You have to essentially just load the VM, set up the IP addresses, et cetera, and you'll essentially be done, right? So it's very neat in that you don't need to worry about troubleshooting between different databases and have to worry about latency and stuff like that. As long as you have the MAS and you set it up correctly, you'll be fine. Now, with respect to a MAS installation, there are some default specifications for the VM in your hypervisor platform, but I'm going to go with what I would recommend to a customer if they installed MAS. What I'd recommend is that they start with like 8 vCPUs, 32 gig RAM. The main hard disk is going to be the default 120 gig hard disk. If possible, I would use a SSD rather than a non-SSD hard disk, just because of like reads and writes, and it uses like your standard 1 virtual NIC and 1 gig throughput. Now, we always recommend a second hard disk if you have a relatively big infrastructure of NetScalers, because since the database exists on the box itself, sometimes you run into issues where the database gets full and you have to go back and start purging data. So if you want to make sure that you'll have plenty of space available, I would strongly recommend that you add a second hard disk, which is completely supported, and I would make it as large as you possibly could. So if you could get like a 1 terabyte hard drive or larger, I would certainly do that. If you could get it as an SSD, that would even be better, but it's not required. But it would affect performance, right? We actually do have a sizing calculator, which is like an Excel document where you've put in your rate of syslog messages and SNMP messages, et cetera, and it can give you a number as well. So you could use that. But as a general guidance, I would definitely say use a second hard disk. And the way it would work is you load up the VM first with the specs that I've described here. And then once the VM is imported into your hypervisor platform, then you go up to storage and add a second hard disk and then start the MAS VM. And when you start it, it'll automatically recognize that a second hard disk has been added, and it'll move all the configuration files for the database from the primary hard disk to the secondary. So you now have a lot more space to play with, and you won't have any issues with the database sizes. In future releases of MAS, we're also going to come with more and more ways of determining what that database looks like and how much storage is used, et cetera. Right now, you can see parts of it on the GUI and other parts through the command line, but you'll be able to see that in more detail in future releases.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. That's pretty informative. Are there any additional deployment-specific considerations related to MAS that customers should be aware of around NetScaler and MAS firmware compatibility, or any version-related topics that they should be aware of?
Yep, absolutely. And there are requirements for a lot of the features that you use on MAS for the NetScalers to be on a specific version. And it really depends on what features you're looking for, right? So if you're looking for, like, say, just the basic stuff like backup, recovery, et cetera, you need to be on 10.1 or higher, which is fairly straightforward, since most of our customers are on 11x. The same goes for, Web Insight, Security Insight, Gateway Insight, et cetera. So we have a table here that describes what versions you need to be in. Now, if you do need something like, say, Gateway Insight, make sure that you look at the specific versions that we've described here, because if you are not on that version, you're going to have a negative impact on MAS. So you may see CPU and memory spike up on the NetScaler or on MAS, et cetera. So you do need to be very, very careful and make sure that you read the fine print on these tables and make sure that your NetScalers are on the right versions, because these are the ones that we've tested and these are the ones that are recommended by Citrix for your NetScalers. As far as the MAS release go, I don't believe I mentioned it before, but you always want to make sure that you're in the latest 12.x release of MAS. I would not stay with 11.1 because a lot of the feature sets that were requested by the field were essentially put in the latest 12.0 GA. So it's completely okay to have a 12.0 release MAS. Just go with the latest release of 12.0 and the versions of NetScalers that you want. So you could be on 11.1 or 10x, et cetera, of NetScalers, but you could still use a 12x MAS. There's not a requirement that says you need to be on the 12.0 NetScaler firmware. You can choose to be, but you don't have to. But we would strongly recommend that most of our customers be on the latest build of 11x, which is 11.1 or 12x to use MAS, as you have better integration between the two platforms.
Okay, understood. So it sounds like surely versioning needs to be paid attention to, but it's simple enough, I think. Thanks for sharing that. Now, every time we talk to customers, there are some common features on MAS that are applicable to almost every NetScaler and even SD-WAN customer. Could you please speak to some of the most commonly deployed features in a MAS implementation?
Sure. When we typically do projects, at least at the consulting side, we're asked a lot to set up a MAS implementation. And generally, when we do a MAS implementation, it does require recommendations for design, which we talked about briefly, architecture, et cetera. But once that's set up, the features that we typically set up are things like backup and restore configuration. You'd be surprised at how little backups are typically done in an organization. So you definitely want to make sure that you have the MAS product take automatic backups of the NetScaler. You can set it up to take backups automatically when you hit Save Config on the NetScaler. So if you're clicking on the GUI and you click on the little Save button, or if you type in Save Config, the NetScaler can be configured to send a trap, OSNMP trap, to MAS, which will in turn back up the configuration. You can even restore it automatically as well. We also have a lot of asks for things like auditing and best practices. While I'll stress that the MAS is not a replacement for, let's say, like a assessment that's done by a partner or a consultant, it certainly gives you a deep look into your configuration and could tell you things that you would want to look at. For example, maybe it hasn't been rebooted in a long time. Maybe there's a memory leak. Maybe there's a upgrade, etc. So it'll actually give you all that information. For folks who are into DevOps, we have Stylebooks, which allows you to create, GUIs that allow folks to do cool things with the NetScaler MAS product. For example, deploying things like Exchange or, upgrades, things like that. A lot of our customers love the certificate management tool. So it automatically goes through your certificates that you have on the NetScaler, determines whether there are any issues with the certificate, whether they're using weak ciphers or strong ciphers, et cetera. So it actually makes all the determinations and makes it crystal clear on a single dashboard. We also have analytics. So we talked about analytics being a premium feature, right? So with analytics, you have HDX Insight, Security Insight, et cetera. And all of these things are essentially reporting functionality and that allow you to look into MAS and be able to identify why and when a user is having problems with their XenApp session, how to troubleshoot it. It also gives you a lot more details on how your users are accessing it, whether there's a potential for any sort of attack or somebody using it in a way that you don't expect, et cetera. So you'll be able to see a lot of things that you potentially before did not have access to. So it's definitely worth looking at and testing it out in your environment. Finally, we have role-based access control, which is a big ask because when users come in and they deploy MAS, they typically don't want everybody to have access to everything. So with MAS, you can actually go up and you can create specific users who have access to very specific subsets of the MAS GUI, including NetScaler. So if I wanted you, Adi, to log into MAS and maybe manage one NetScaler and maybe just look at, say, SL certificates only, I could do that. So it's very, very granular, and it allows me to set it up in a way that allows me to restrict control, so you wouldn't be able to do any damage to the NetScaler. And you can customize that in any way you want as well. So a lot of flexibility there.
Yeah, that sounds like a great feature to have, especially as more customers look to MAS as a centralized management tool. And speaking of centralized management, I know we had many customers that used config jobs. In fact, we still have customers that use config jobs and Command Center to run repeatable configurations with some user input to roll out configs directly from Command Center instead of having to log into each individual NetScaler. This gets super complicated in large NetScaler environments. So we've been hearing about style books, and do you mind comparing and contrasting config jobs and style books to help customers understand what would their transition be like going from Command Center to MAS, and also the differences between config jobs and style books would be greatly valuable, I think.
Sure. In the Command Center product, we actually had the ability to create a custom task that would allow you to push config to various NetScalers, and that's been translated to config jobs on MAS as well. So imagine that you've stood up like some NetScalers. Let's say you have about 50 NetScalers, and you want to essentially make sure that the configuration is very consistent. So maybe you have a certain number of SNMP servers, maybe a certain number of syslog servers, maybe you want to set up NTP servers or some baseline config, et cetera, right? And these NetScalers are located all over the globe with different IP addresses, with different credentials, et cetera, right? It can take a long time to go into each one and manually go in and create this configuration on the GUI or the CLI. Now with config jobs, what you can do is you can create essentially a script, and you can make it, you can set it up so that you can ask for user input as well. But the idea is that you create a script that would then be pushed to all those NetScalers, which is pretty cool. Because now I can create this one script and push it to about 100 NetScalers or more, however many NetScalers that I want, with just one click of a button, and it'll tell me which one succeeded, which one failed, and why it failed, et cetera. So it'll give me a lot of details. And if I want users to maybe customize it a little bit with their user input, et cetera, I can choose to do that as well. So with MAS, one thing that I don't believe Command Center had is we have a record and play option where you can actually go in and record what you typically do on one NetScaler. So what I would do is I'd go into the NetScaler, hit record, and do the things that I would potentially repeat on those 100 NetScalers. The MAS would then generate a configuration script based on that. I could then customize it and save it and then push it on to those other boxes. So it's really neat. I do want to talk about just one thing that I noticed when I was working with a customer. Previously, this was probably several months back in 11.1, we had an issue with the $sign. And the $sign is something that's used for a variable, right? So typically in config jobs, if you want to define a variable, it's a $sign, then the variable name, and then the $sign again. But when you're using the URL transformation feature, the $sign is actually used as part of the config. And MAS would get confused and it wouldn't quite work. And while we had a workaround, we did tell the product team that we wanted to make sure that gets fixed. So I'm happy to report that in 12x, we've now fixed it, and you can actually use URL transformation that uses like special characters like $, et cetera, and it doesn't get confused with the variable, which uses a $in the front and in the end. So just wanted to point that out. I do have some details I want to share about style books as well. So one of your questions before was, okay, what's the difference between a config job versus style book? So config jobs is, something that I would push as like a script onto like multiple NetScalers. Now think about, different business units within your organization. Now they may need to deploy Exchange or Skype or, APIC load balancing with like Cisco, et cetera. Now we have built-in style books that allow you to do that. And what that means is you essentially go to MAS and you can just pull open the style book. It'll ask you a bunch of entries like, names, IP addresses, parameters, et cetera. Once you fill that out and hit submit, you can essentially point to a NetScaler and it'll build the config for you. Now, if you click on X to cancel it, it'll roll back the config for you. So it's extremely useful when you need to deploy applications. You can certainly create your own style book as well. That does, require you to know some YAML, right, which stands for yet another markup language. It's pretty common and it's used in like different orchestration platforms like Chef, Puppet, et cetera, as well, and Nitro API. And one of the things that consultants from the CCS organization get asked to do quite a bit is like create custom style books based on a requirements, right? So with the style book, kind of similar to these built-in ones, you can create like a GUI that allow for business units to click on stuff, answer some questions, and deploy the config. And you can roll it back like I pointed out. If you want to create a style book for a customer, the first thing you'd want to identify is what are they looking to do? Make sure the configuration is defined properly, figure out what sort of input you need, et cetera. And then once you sort of get all that stuff, then you would write your own style book. And I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about some of the gotchas that you need to be aware of as it pertains to the style books.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, that'll be great. But Maz, with all this information, about the NetScaler environment, your application environment, stores a lot of valuable and sensitive data. So, how do you recommend customers secure access to it?
Yep. So before we get into the securing stuff, I want to just talk briefly about the style books and the caveats first. But in terms of caveats, you want to make sure that the YAML syntax is correct. You want to use a YAML validator to verify the syntax is correct. And the reason I want to talk about style book caveats before I go into securing Maz is a lot of customers may be very interested in creating their own style books. And I want to make sure they learn from my lessons and from the troubles I went to when I created this. So definitely want to make sure that they understand how the YAML syntax works and make sure they use a YAML validator. We have a link in the slide notes that kind of points to some YAML validators that you can use. You also want to reference the Nitro API reference guide to make sure that you are using up the right commands. If you're not using the right commands from the Nitro API, it's going to be problematic and you're going to have issues. So you definitely want to make sure you look at the API, and it's definitely better to have some experience working with APIs if you're not familiar with it. Style books also have predictable patterns that needs to be followed, like headers, parameters, etc. So you want to make sure you look at that. You can also troubleshoot style books by looking at the nitro.log or the SB API logger.log, and we've given kind of those instructions on where to find those logs as well in the notes section. So now, Adi, I'll kind of talk about the security aspect of Maz, right? Now, the security of Maz is something that we do typically with NetScalers as well. So this is not something that is specific to Maz, but we actually use this for NetScalers and other devices as well. Obviously, the first thing that you want to do is you want to change the default password of Maz, right? It comes with like a password of NSRoot with the username NSRoot. So while you can't change the username, you definitely want to make sure that you change the password to Maz. Maz also has a way to enforce password complexity. So if you go to settings, you can increase the number of characters. So that'll at least force you to specify a password that is complex in terms of characters. So you want to make sure that it's not something like password 123, etc. You also want to make sure that you add like a second local root account just as a backdoor, but also with a secure password in case you forget what the NSRoot password is. You want to make sure that you enable secure only, which means that users cannot get to it through HTTP access, right? The minute you do that, you'll be redirected to use the HTTPS link, which will make sure that your configuration is secure. While the topic of in the secure only, you want to make sure that you change the default certificate from the self-signed certificate that it comes with to a internal certificate as well. If you use an internal certificate, it's probably more secure and you have more control over it, and you know when it's going to expire, etc. I would certainly recommend that if you're using a certificate, make sure that you're using a password on the private key file with the passphrase, so you're making sure that it's secure as well. You can use role-based access control to limit access to features. We talked about that before. You also want to make sure that while you can send syslog data to Maz, you also want to make sure that you get Maz-related data somewhere else. And that's where you want to make sure that you have a third-party syslog server, and you can configure MAS to send its data over there. So if MAS has any problems, or if you want to just identify what folks are doing in MAS, you can send that somewhere else. If you want to limit access to who gets access to the MAS server in your network, you can use like ACLs and stuff like that to limit access to the MAS server. And you can also set it up access with like third-party authentication databases like LDAP, Radius, etc., with a fallback to local database. So users are using their standard LDAP account rather than remembering yet another account for credentials when they log into MAS. Let's see, SNMP is obviously important. The NetScaler uses SNMP for discovery for the MAS, and by default, I believe it uses SNMP v2. SNMP v3 is the latest in security and secure standard, so if possible, use SNMP v3 rather than SNMP v2. You also want to make sure that anytime you're taking backups of the NetScaler, you protect it with a password, and we do have an option to specify encryption and passwords on backups. Now, one thing to remember, and this is something that I found out, was that if you do back something like a config up with a password, you're not going to be able to download it and view it on your computer because only MAS can open it. So, but if you back up a, say, config without a password, you'll be able to open it up in your computer and check it out, etc. So keep that in mind. But if it does have a password in it, you'll still be able to recover it and restore it within the MAS program itself. So just a caveat. And I believe that that's noted now on the MAS GUI as well.
Oh, wow, this is great. Yeah, I know our resources from our security practice review these aspects of the configuration pertaining to NetScaler as well as MAS quite closely when we do our consulting projects. So this is great to share with the larger audience. While we are on the topic of security-related recommended practices, are there any additional recommendations that you have to bring more resiliency into the MAS environment?
Sure. Let me talk about a few more practices that we have, recommended practices we have, that comes to mind. You definitely want to have NTP on the NetScaler and the MAS server as well, and make sure that your time is synchronized. We talked about making sure that you be on the latest version of the 12.0 GA, and you want to make sure that you validate all your functionality in a lab or test environment, which you can do very easily with like an STX appliance. And you also want to make sure you check your release notes for any known issues with app flow, et cetera, and make sure you're in the latest build of 11x or 12x. Now, as far as resiliency goes, NetScaler supports, NetScaler MAS, or Citrix MAS rather, does support either a standalone deployment or an active standby. Right? Now, if you set up an active standby configuration for redundancy, you want to make sure you set up your other MAS VM to be set up in the same manner as your primary one. So you need to make sure that the specs match up. If you have multiple hard disks, you need to make sure the hard disks are set up correctly, the versions are the same, etc. So you can set those up correctly. If you set those up correctly, you will have a active standby setup. Well, in my tips and tricks part of the presentation, we'll talk about the command that you need to run on the CLI to essentially set up the active standby config for redundancy.
Okay, gotcha. I think those NTP things, NTP stuff, and the other recommended practices are valuable because those are some sorts of secret gotchas. And the order of operations does strangely, the right order of operations strangely protects you from these future issues. So thanks for sharing those as well.
Yep, definitely. One thing I will point out, though, I think this is a question that may come up is, can I migrate from Insight Center to MAS or Command Center to MAS, et cetera? And yes, while we do have guides that support doing that migration, personally, from a consulting standpoint, I prefer that we start with a greenfield environment to kind of set up MAS independently and set up the configuration. It's just a cleaner approach, in my opinion, that we've seen with our customers as well, and that's a recommendation that we provide. But there is it is supported to do this sort of automated migration from Insight Center, et cetera, and you can follow those links that we will share in the slide deck for those as well.
Okay. Yep. That answers my next question. So moving on, I know that a lot of our customers have started using APIs to manage their NetScaler as well as their MAS and NetScaler environment specifically. So I guess you already pulled up the slide on that provides a comparison. So do you mind speaking to this?
Yeah, no problem. And the reason why I put the slide together was, there's a lot of confusion, at least from what I see, about the different sort of APIs and functionality that's offered for DevOps, right? So I'll talk first about Nitro API. So Nitro API has been around for a while now. We used to have something called the XML API that was used with like the older versions of NetScalers, and then that got moved over to the Nitro API, which can be used to essentially query the NetScaler, and you can automate really anything on the NetScaler. And if you know scripting like PowerShell or Perl or C#, et cetera, you can set it up with Nitro API to do things like enabling, disabling services, maybe pull up stats, or doing certain sort of configuration tasks, et cetera. So that's always been there, right? Now, we also have a feature in MAS called Stylebooks that we talked about before that uses YAML, right? Now, YAML does use Nitro API. So you do have to know some Nitro API, or you have to know how to call them from a stylebook in order to use it. But the important thing that I wanted to call out here, Adi, is that stylebooks require you to know Nitro API. You can use Nitro API to call things directly on the NetScaler, or you can use it in the context of a stylebook that essentially uses a Nitro API to push certain types of configuration, give you the GUI, the rollback, et cetera, that allows you to do that as well. Finally, we also have a MAS API. So let's say, I use stylebooks to create, a few stylebooks, et cetera, to do certain things, right? That calls API, and that works on MAS. But I want to programmatically call that from somewhere. Well, MAS has its own API, similar to Nitro API. I can actually now call those stylebooks directly from PowerShell or Perl, et cetera, and essentially, call on those stylebooks and those tasks. So if I wanted to say, I wanted to run this specific stylebook on this specific NetScaler, I can now do that without interacting with MAS or the GUI. I can do that now on the command line. So it's pretty neat. We've seen a few customers do that as well. So as we see more and more folks using MAS and using DevOps extensively in their environment, we've seen folks using a combination of Nitro API, stylebooks, as well as MAS API to complete the picture, to make their life easier, to automate things, and to make sure that they can handle a lot more NetScalers with minimal resources.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I guess that also helps with the integration of the various components in automating and a larger network environment. So this is great. Now, obviously, you've spoken to quite a few recommended practices, and you've spoken to the resiliency aspect of the MAS environment. What other tips and tricks can you share with the customers here?
Yep, I actually have quite a bit of tips and tricks in my next few slides. I'll go over them, fairly quickly, and obviously, you guys can feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. One of the first things that I kind of see is just the MAS GUI itself. So when you start to load up the NetScaler MAS GUI by trying to get to it, you may see like a blank page or something like that. So that can happen when you have caching issues. So I definitely, when I try to load up MAS GUI, I try to load it up in an incognito window so it shows up correctly and I can get to it. So, if you have problems where it doesn't show up in your standard browse mode, definitely use the incognito window in your various browsers to use it. I typically use, Chrome or Firefox, but, certainly same thing could work for IE as well. If you're using the MAS VM on ESX, you may want to refer to the ESX sort of guide on sort of any sort of issues when it comes to like allocating resources. So that I know that we've had some known issues before with the NIC driver with the E1000, so that may be something to look at. If you are looking to see Security Insight is a feature for app firewall, so you'd want to make sure that you have a platinum license on the NetScaler, which is standard with SDX. If you're not seeing a VPX that shows up on MAS, then you need to be very careful and make sure that you've completed both the SDX profile and the VPX profile. So because of the fact that like all this discovery phase happens through profiles with accounts and SMP communities, et cetera, and an SDX is essentially a VPX on top of the SDX, you have to go through the GUI to create an SDX profile first, and within the SDX profile, you have to click on the little plus icon to create a VPX profile, and that'll make sure that you're seeing like all the VPXs on the SDXs as well. Now, let's say, it's been a while since you set up your MAS server and you forgot what the IP address is, but you still have access to the VM. and this is something that I do a whole lot because I have a terrible memory. I go into the VM, I just go to the console, log in with my username and my password that has been changed, mind you, and type in network config from shell. So you get that little greater than sign. So you have to type in shell, type in network config, and it allows you to kind of see the IP address, the gateway, et cetera. If you're feeling, a little bit more adventurous, you can, do a cat on the npsconfig.svm.conf, and that'll show you that as well. One of the things that Adi had asked, Adi, that you had asked before was like, how do I change it from a standalone to HA for redundancy? And you can do this from the command line by typing in from the shell deployment _type.py. PY stands for Python script. And when you do that, it actually allows you to add a second mass server as a backup. And like I said before, you need to make sure that you have the same version, the same memory, spec, storage, et cetera. So everything needs to match up. But if you have everything identical, then you'll be able to set that up correctly. Okay, let me move on to a few more tips and tricks that I've had. You definitely want to make sure that you use the syslog server on mass or a syslog component on mass to send the mass-related syslog events to a third-party syslog server. We talked about using the certificates. Now, one thing to remember in mass is that only PEM certificates are supported, right? So on the NetScaler, if you guys are using like latest 11.1 or 12x, you'll notice that you can import either a PFX certificate, which is like a Windows certificate, or a PEM certificate, which is typically used with Linux platforms. In mass today, we only support PEM certificates, so you may need to use OpenSSL or some other utility to convert your PFX certificates to PEM, or just get PEM certificates straight off the bat to make sure that you can install those. Once you load the certificate, the mass service is going to restart, and once it restarts, you'll get back to the mass login page on HTTPS, and now you can go up to the root and type in HTTPS, whatever the FQDN that you put in from your DNS, etc. If you don't get redirected and you get like a blank window, just make sure you open up an incognito window and just type in HTTPS and the FQDN of the mass server, and you'll be able to log in. I have seen some caching issues before, at least even with the certificate replacement as well. Let me see. Okay. Backups. You definitely want to increase the number of backups, especially if you've taken up on our tip that I mentioned before to add a second hard disk, right? I mean, I like to have a lot of backups, so I typically add in like 10 at the very least. We talked about the password protected option, so you could click to select that if you wanted to protect it with a password. You can define when you want the backup to take place, whether you want it done every few hours or whether you want it done at a specific time. One cool thing that I really like in the 12.0 that we requested an enhancement for in 11 was the fact that previously the database files would get backed up on every NetScaler. And that would be a problem because database files are typically really, really large, and you want to make sure that you have the option to exclude those. So now in the 12.0 GA release, you can now determine whether you want to select it or just leave it as is. If you do select it, just make sure that you have a large database or the second hard disk to compensate for that. The one thing that I did talk about before as well was the option to back up when an instance trap is received, and that's a checkbox that you see under NetScaler settings. So as long as SNMP is configured correctly, when you hit save, we'll automatically do a backup. So it's a cool feature. I like it. It's not turned on by default. I certainly recommend that you look into it if you want that backup to happen every time you do a save. You can also specify how long you want to keep the database. So if you only care about keeping the data for a certain number of time or a certain number of days, you can specify the number of days here, and you can set it up to automatically purge it once it gets to like a certain percentage as well, right? And the default, I think, is set to like 80%. So that way your database is trimmed correctly, and you don't run into any sort of issues with the database. All right. I also mentioned, I think, maybe in the first few slides, that we have a configuration audit option where you get configuration advice for the NetScaler. So you can just upload a config file, or you can select the device in question, and you can click on that big blue button that says Get Config, and it'll automatically evaluate your NetScaler, tell you what's good, what's bad, etc. So it's a good first starter, and but you want to make sure that you take it with a grain of salt. So it may recommend features that you may not need. Like, for example, it may ask you why caching is not turned on, etc. So take it with a grain of salt, but it does have some really good feedback that I've seen, and I think it's a good feature, but it's not a substitution for a proper assessment that may be done by a third party. So look into this, use it, but definitely be aware of your own situation with your NetScalers and your data centers. So Adi, I think those are pretty much most of the tips that I had at this point.
Wow, that's quite a few of them. It sounds like we could dedicate a webinar just for tips and tricks. Thanks for sharing those with the group.
No problem.
In your experience, though, knowing all this about the platform and knowing a little bit about the recommended practices, I'm sure you've run into issues that you had to troubleshoot. Do you have any guidance on what are certain tools or some tactics on troubleshooting MAS deployments better?
Sure. I mean, being a network guy, one of the things that I always do is just go right back to taking a trace, right? So you can take a trace in Windows and Linux operating systems using tools like WinDump, TCPDump, Wireshark, etc. So similar to that, we offer you TCPDump as well. So you can Google TCPDump syntax and essentially run that on MAS if you want to just debug something. So for example, if your LDAP server is not working or something is not being recognized correctly, you can drop down to shell and then just run TCPDump syntax just based on normal TCPDump syntax that you would find pretty much anywhere, and look for certain things to try to kind of see what's happening behind the scenes. Right? I would certainly make sure that I'm on the latest 12.0 version of MAS. I would make sure that I look at the version of NetScaler I'm on. Preferably, like I said, I would be on the latest 11.1 or 12x version of the NetScaler. I would also make sure that I look at the troubleshooting guides that we have. So Citrix support and product management has done a great job in compiling, a dozen or more articles that you can find at the link. I didn't want to go over each of those separately, but we'll be out of time. But certainly click on the link and bookmark that, because you'll be able to see a lot of helpful troubleshooting guides from that link that will be very, very helpful.
Yep, thanks for sharing that, Jay. So I guess clearly there's a lot of content that we could cover just on the topic of MAS, whether it's recommended practices, tips and tricks, troubleshooting, gotchas, that sort of stuff. And there's a wealth of knowledge that our team can offer. There's multiple ways that Citrix can help with streamlining MAS deployments and helping you get up to speed with the product, start introducing that into your environment, and make our customers successful. So that's what really our professional services team comes into play. Our professional services team comprises of consulting services as well as education services. And the primary reason why Citrix customers opt for consulting services and education is to help them enable and accelerate their Citrix product adoption. We help eliminate risk. So new products like MAS really poses a certain level of uncertainty and raises concerns around the stability of an existing larger NetScaler or networking environment for that matter. We also can help fill in a knowledge gap that results in, and that knowledge gap usually comes in with the adoption of new technologies like MAS. So our professional services team can help fill in that gap with our team. We also understand that our customers, admins, and engineers are thinly stretched, and in a lean operations, it becomes challenging to learn a new product like MAS and deploy it the best that our customers could possibly could deploy when you have multiple projects on the plate. So we not only help augment your capacity, but we also help accelerate your deployments. Our consulting services team and our education services help anticipate, identify, and proactively expedite Citrix issue resolutions associated with MAS as well. So we can help you with filling this knowledge gap, and at the same time enhance your expertise in our newer products. So we could start with either a POC or even a production deployment with a limited scope of impact. And we surely have the tools, and we have the right offerings in the market that can help you with it. So if you're looking at the slide right now, we have education offerings with our CNS 319 being a MAS-focused 2-day course. And then we also have a CNS 320 and 340 that have MAS topics covered on larger NetScaler topics. With Citrix Consulting Services, for net new deployments, we can help remove this knowledge barrier with help from a MAS Quick Start style offering that covers some of the most commonly deployed features that we just discussed. But we can also create highly customized project scopes to capture our customers' environment-specific uniqueness. We have been recently involved in creating several custom projects like these, a few of them involving customized style books to help navigate our customers towards simplifying common configuration tasks associated with NetScalers using style books and config jobs on MAS. You can contact your local account team to get in touch with Jay and I so we can help navigate you towards a successful MAS deployment. So, all right, before we move into Q&A, I would like to remind our audience that if you have a question for our speakers, Jay and I, you can submit it in the Ask a Question area on your screen. And for that, you can simply type in your question into the text box and then hit Submit. So let's transition over to questions and answers.
Hey, Jay, I think Adi's having some technical difficulties. You want to go ahead and start with question 1?
Sure. Can you hear me okay, Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So the first question was just regarding IPv4. So the question was, my company's implemented Microsoft Direct Access to implement MAS, and the IP addresses are IPv4, and it doesn't work because it's trying to use an IPv4. Is it capable of using FQDN versus IPv4? I typically use IPv4 myself. I don't use FQDNs to add to discover instances. So I would go with IP addresses, but I can certainly find out whether FQDNs will be supported. I think Adi's back. Adi, are you on?
I am. Yep. Sorry, I had another one of those mute button issues.
No problem. All right. So I believe that we have a few more questions. Do you want to moderate those?
Sure thing. Yep. So the second question here is there an enterprise license? Is there an enterprise license as we have 17,000 VIPs? So the answer to that is yes, we do offer licenses beyond the 30 VIP free version from an analytics standpoint. So you can purchase licenses in groups of 100 VIPs. So essentially, you can for 17,000 VIPs. But by the way, we do license them based on virtual servers, not VIPs. So in case that if that clarification helps to a certain degree. So let's assume that it's 17,000 virtual servers, then that means that you're going to need to have a few of those 100 virtual server packs. So that would make it 170 virtual server packs. Now I know that they're also working on some additional licensing variations for you to be able to purchase larger chunks of virtual servers in the future. But again, that isn't out there yet. All I can say is right now you would have to purchase 170 packs of 100 virtual servers. The third question was, do you need to purchase licensing for XenApp servers? So if I have 100 XenApp servers, do I need to buy extra licensing? The answer is MAS licensing is independent of XenApp licenses. So yes, you would have to purchase separate licensing for MAS. The fourth question is, can you discuss the experience with installing the telemetry node for advanced analytics? Should the specifications for the VM be the same as the MAS VM, especially in regards to the storage allocation? So this feature is in beta at the moment, and it has been most recently introduced with the 12.0 version. So we do have some specifications on our documentation side under advanced analytics. There's more to come on this topic with the future GA releases in the 12.0 code base. The fifth question is, can you discuss the experience with? Okay, sorry, we just answered that. The sixth question is, can NetScaler MAS as a service be used with on-premise NetScaler appliances? I think the answer is yes, but Jay, would you confirm that, please?
Yep, the answer is yes. I mean, it is designed to work with on-prem NetScaler. So the idea with MAS as a service is that you have these agents or connectors that essentially connect to the control plane in the cloud and give you analytics with MAS as a service. So yes, absolutely, you can do that. And I think we did mention in the presentation that say 30 days. So if you guys are interested, I would definitely look into it.
Thanks, Jay. The seventh question here is there a third-party database planned in future releases, let's say MS SQL? So the answer, we surely will be providing additional information about the future releases, you know, as things move forward and as the product itself progresses within the field. As of right now, the MAS uses an internal database, so we haven't heard anything about leveraging a third-party database as of yet.
Yep, and I'll also add to that, Adi, is that as far as we know, the decision was made to use a product with a built-in database. I don't believe that there are going to be any sort of major architectural changes like adding a third-party database, but never say never. So we'll touch base with the product management team, and we'll confirm that for you in our blog as well.
Thanks, Jay. So I think we're at the top of the hour. We don't have a whole lot of time for more than one question, so we'll take one more question, and we will have to close the chat. So the final question is, are there any significant benefits for using NetScaler MAS in an environment with only a single HA pair of NetScalers? Jay, you want to take it? This is definitely a loaded question and would be a good close for the conversation today.
Yep, I would absolutely say yes. You know, one of the biggest things that MAS provides is automatic backup and restore of the NetScaler, certificate management, pushing config tasks, etc. Whether I have one HA pair or 5, it's extremely useful to have that. It's separate. As consultants, when we go out in the field, we do see that configs are not being backed up and things are still being done manually. So if you guys are looking for automation, if you guys are looking for a way to have backups and you want to show, you know, how the NetScaler is performing and have a predictive approach to troubleshooting problems, I think MAS is a great product. So I would certainly use it and POC it in your own environment, even if it's just for a single pair of NetScalers.
Excellent. Thanks, Jay. So we do have quite a few more questions that are still coming in. The list is pretty long. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through every one of them. However, please feel free to post your questions on the blog site so Jay and I can take a look at them and respond them on the site directly. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. Jay, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Nope, that was it. We're seeing a lot of great questions, and we're certainly going to make every effort to answer all of them in our blog, so stay tuned.